As we begin this video on the tone curve and how to use the tone curve in particular, we are very quickly going to realize that you're not going to be using the tone curve in isolation. We're also going to be using our basic panel with our highlights, shadows, whites and blacks sliders to fine-tune exactly what it is that we're trying to do. For this part of the video, I'm going to use this image of lichens on a boulder. And it demonstrates a typically well exposed raw file, which is exposed to the right whilst watching the highlights. We're quite close to the whites being fully exposed, and the rest of the image has fallen into this bright mid-tones. And what that's typically giving us is a huge amount of data that we can now manipulate to produce an image that looks the way we want it to look, and in this case demonstrate the points that we want to make. Now, the first thing I want to do is set the black and white points using curves, which is a different way from doing it from the way we did before. So we're going to use the J key to turn on our highlight warning indicators, and we have a couple of different views in the curve. We have this point curve and we also have a regional curve. We are going to work with the point curve because this is the best one to use for what we're trying to do here. To set the black point first, we click on the furthest left point on the graph, and we drag it to the right, and we will see the image will darken. And if we keep our eye on the warning indicator, it finally clips, so we pull it back, and that is our black point set. The same for the white point. We click in the top right hand corner of the tone curve and we drag to the left, and this is going to brighten those highlights until we get to a point where we clip the highlights, and we now have a white point set here and a black point set there. So what the curve can be used for predominantly is global contrast, and we want to make a distinction here between global contrast and local contrast. At this stage in the videos, we are totally dealing in global adjustments. Everything we do to the image, whether it's dealing with exposure or color or contrast or clarity, it is all global. So if we add a typical S curve here, quite a dramatic S curve in fact, we will notice that the entire image has got significantly more punchy. And if we compare that to where we started off, obviously what's happened is that the darker shadowy areas here are significantly darker. We have brighter highlights, and where the colors have darkened significantly, we can start to see quite a lot of color, because as we've demonstrated already, contrast and color are linked. The darker and more contrasty an image gets, the more colorful it will get also, before we actually start dealing with color at all separately in later parts in the video. So this overall feeling of global contrast, you will notice that as we have darkened some of these darker midtones, we have actually clipped the shadows again. If we want to pick up the blacks and move them to the right a little, we can then unclip those shadows and we get back to a point where we have a perfect histogram with no clipped blacks and no clipped whites. The most fundamental thing to understand here is that the steeper the curve, such as in this mid-tone section, the more contrast there is in those areas. As it shallows out here and at the top of the curve here, we are now demonstrating less contrast. So there's less contrast in the highlights and there's less contrast in the shadows. If we pick up this image of the lichens where we left it off at the end of the tone curve, we had developed a point where we said this is our global contrast, and it was quite punchy. And what we're going to do just now is demonstrate that by using the highlights and shadow sliders, that we can increase details in the shadows and highlights by varying the exposure of those areas. If we notice the shadows first, the black point is here, and then we're moving quite quickly up to this mid-tone plateau. And the steepness of this curve indicates contrast. So again, the steeper the curve, the more contrast there is between the blacks and the darker shadows. So if I click on the shadows slider and increase the shadows, we can see that the histogram here has shallowed out, which basically means we have decreased the contrast in the shadows, which basically means that we have opened them up. So we are seeing more detail in the shadows than we had before. The same applies for highlights. We have a very steep curve between the whites and the brightest midtones, and if we take the highlight slider and decrease it, we can see that we're flattening out that curve in this area here, and the brighter areas of this image are now more detailed. If I take a snapshot here of the situation after those adjustments and I go back to where we were, we can see that the punch of the image has been decreased because we've kind of decreased contrast. We've opened up the details in the shadows, we've opened up the details in the highlights, and the image is slightly flatter, but it's much more detailed. Now, the second thing that I want to consider here is the clarity slider, because what we're doing is that we're showing details in dynamic range. So we're basically saying that we're showing a lot more nuances of detail in our shadows, right through our midtones and then into our brighter highlights and whites. Clarity is a detail slider. If we move it quite dramatically way over to the right, we end up going back to that very punchy look, because what we're doing is we're creating micro contrast. And if I make a snapshot of that there, that's something we can go back to momentarily. It's almost like a very aggressive edge sharpening. And if you zoom in, you'll see that it's really sharpened those areas up really massively. And it's created this very highly textured, extremely aggressive, very in-your-face type of image. If, by contrast, I move the clarity slider all the way down to the 0 setting, the -100 setting, it's created this super painterly image, which is very soft and very ethereal and very easy on the eye. Now, where you decide to put your clarity slider on any image of yours is entirely up to you. You may want to create an image that looks like this, you may want to produce one that looks like this, or somewhere in between. But you should by now be aware that there are highlights and shadow sliders available to help you bring out dynamic range detail in your shadows and highlights, and also a clarity slider which helps you bring texture or reduce texture in the whole image as a global adjustment. This is an ideal image on which to demonstrate how contrast affects color and then how we can deal with color in its own right. So first of all, let's just take the black and white points as we had before and quickly set our black and white points, and that has instantly given us more contrast. If we then darken our shadows and increase slightly our highlights, we have created a much more contrasty image. We can take our midtones down separately, and really this is all about making adjustments as we have done already, just to show you some of these things again. I'm now going to take the temperature down a little bit because I think it was a little bit too warm, and I'm wanting to create some more tonal differences between some of these colors. I want to try and introduce some of the blues into here. Now, a lot of colors are hidden in raw files. You don't see everything that's there because you're exposing to the right and everything just gets turned into a midtone. If we look at the luminance of the HSL slider first, luminance is brightness. So if we click on this little tool here, we can actually alter the color and contrast by brightening or darkening certain tones. So in here we have these tones here which are actually quite blue, and we can darken those tones and we have affected contrast. We can take some of these lighter tan colors and brighten them, and we are increasing contrast by dealing with the luminosity of specific colors. We're actually getting into a local adjustment here because we're only targeting very local points, but there are still being affected globally, as it were. If I want to increase the saturation of those blues, I can do so, and increase the saturation of those warmer tones. And I think we can afford to take this down a little cooler. And you can see how those blues have really come to life. And if we just pop the vibrance a touch, vibrance, as you know, is targeting unsaturated colors, and then the saturation deals with a global change. Look how much blue we're brought into here. This is not a demonstration of how to make a pretty image. This is just a demonstration of what you can actually do with these tools. I'm not saying this is what I would want to actually do. If we compare that with where we started off, it's quite incredible how far we've brought this image with just a few strokes. So the main things to realize with using this tool with saturation and luminosity, you can target specific tones. So let's say we want to brighten those blues again to make them a little bit less ridiculous, then we can bring that back up to 0 point. So that will do now for the HSL panel, and it's quite clear how the brightness and contrast within an image affects the color. I've made a few adjustments to this image to get it to a stage where I'm reasonably happy with it as an overall global adjustment. Now it's gone from here, which is quite a warm, well exposed raw file, to something that's cooler, darker, more contrasty. All I've done is made adjustments as we have been discussing through the rest of these videos. So we're at a stage now where the thing is looking globally as I want it to be. The color is correct for my mind. The contrast is right both globally, and there's details where I want them to be. Now, the last thing I want to demonstrate with this is what's called the radial filter. And what it does is it produces, if you click and drag, you produce an ellipse, which can then be shaped to any shape you want, really. So you can bring it so it just touches the frame edges like that. And what's going to happen is, if I reduce the exposure, it's going to reduce the exposure on the outside of that ellipse that I drew. And the feather adjusts just that, how marked that transition is. Obviously, if there's no feather, you end up with an ellipse. If it's 100% feather, then the center of the image is actually being affected a little bit as well. I usually tend to pull it back to somewhere in the sort of 70% range. I tend to find that that's a good middle of the road kind of setting. And we can adjust exposure, obviously, but we can also change other things. So if we wanted to increase the clarity at the edges, for example, increase the saturation at the edges. And what it's doing is, because we're darkening the image at the edges, it appears to make the inside of the ellipse lighter. And by doing that, if we turn it on and off, it draws the eye very dramatically into the center of the frame and holds it there much longer, purely because the eye will be drawn to the brightest areas. And if there's shadows around these corners, it diffuses the frame edge, because obviously these 4 lines of the frame are very important, and how they interact with these the sides of these mountains on either side of the frame, they become quite strong focal points because they're incredibly graphic. And we need to draw the eye into the areas of highest contrast, the brightest areas of the frame. Using the radial filter in Lightroom, allows us to successfully draw the eye into the center of the frame and hold it there and not let it spill out into the edges of the frame and beyond.